The house that was never sold. Daniel parked the car in front of the house and left the engine running longer than necessary. The place looked smaller than he remembered, as if time had quietly folded it inward. The paint was tired, the gate slightly crooked, the garden reduced to stubborn weeds that refused to die. Nothing about the house was dramatic, and yet the silence around it felt deliberate, as though it had been waiting. He turned off the engine and stepped out, keys in hand, the metal cold against his fingers. This was supposed to be simple, a signature, a sale, an ending long overdue. He had told himself that many times on the drive over. Still, his body hesitated before the gate, responding to something his mind refused to name. When he pushed it open, the hinges complained softly. The sound echoed longer than it should have. Inside, the air carried the faint smell of dust and old wood. The furniture was gone, but their absence felt outlined,
as if the rooms remembered where things used to be. Daniel walked slowly, careful with his steps, aware of how loud they sounded. Every movement seemed to disturb a fragile balance. He paused in the hallway. The light there was thinner, filtered through a window that hadn't been cleaned in years. For a moment, he had the irrational impression that the house was not empty, only quiet. Not abandoned, only restrained. "This won't take long," he said aloud, more for himself than for the space around him. He moved from room to room, mentally listing repairs, estimating value, forcing himself into the familiar comfort of numbers and practicality. But the house resisted that logic. Each corner offered small interruptions, a mark on the wall, a door that closed too slowly, the faint echo of footsteps that did not feel entirely his own. When he reached what had once been his bedroom, Daniel stopped. The room was bare, yet something in his chest tightened, sudden and sharp.
Like a memory trying to surface without permission. He stepped back, unsettled by the feeling that this place had not been waiting for a buyer, but for him, and that he was already late. Daniel had built his life on forward motion. That was how he liked to think of it, steady, deliberate, uninterrupted. Leaving the house behind had been part of that movement, a necessary step in becoming someone functional, reliable, unburdened. He rarely looked back, and when he did, it was with the detached curiosity one reserves for things already resolved. His work as a real estate broker suited him. Properties were simple. They existed to be evaluated, improved, transferred. Walls did not demand explanations. Rooms did not ask questions. Everything had a price, and once agreed upon, nothing lingered. People often described him as calm, organized, someone who always seemed in control. He kept his apartment immaculate, his schedule tight, his relationships polite and distant.
He avoided excess, too much emotion, too much intimacy, too much noise. Silence, he had learned, was manageable. What Daniel did not say, what he had never quite articulated even to himself, was that this discipline had a purpose. It kept certain thoughts from settling. It prevented memories from forming connections they should not make. His life worked because it did not allow space for reflection. Yet, standing in his childhood bedroom again, that structure faltered. He noticed how his breathing had changed, shallow and cautious, as though the room required permission. The walls felt closer here, less forgiving than the open-plan apartment he now lived in. This space did not accommodate reinvention. It remembered too much. Daniel tried to reassure himself with facts. He had been a child. Children adapted. Children forgot. Whatever had happened here had been handled by adults, by time, by distance. He told himself that often enough that it had become almost true. Still,
An unease followed him as he moved back into the hallway. Not fear exactly, something subtler, a sensation like standing on a surface that appeared solid but sounded hollow beneath his feet. He realized then that he had always carried this feeling, in meetings, in quiet evenings, in moments when he should have felt satisfied. a low, persistent pressure he had labeled stress, fatigue, responsibility, anything but what it might actually be. Daniel leaned against the wall and closed his eyes briefly. He told himself again that selling the house would close a chapter, that once it was gone, whatever pull it had on him would dissolve. But as he opened his eyes, he understood something he had never allowed before. His life had moved on. Something inside him had not. The memory did not arrive all at once. It surfaced in pieces, disconnected and tentative, like fragments drifting toward one another without quite touching. Daniel leaned against the doorframe and let them come,
resisting the instinct to organize them into something coherent. It had been summer, that much he knew. The kind of summer that felt endless at the time, marked by long afternoons and open windows. He remembered the heat first, the way it clung to the walls, the way voices carried further when the house was quiet. He remembered sitting on the floor of the living room, tracing shapes on the carpet while the ceiling fan turned slowly overhead. What stood out was not an event, but a change. Adults began to whisper. Conversation stopped when he entered a room. His name appeared more often in sentences that ended abruptly. Doors that had once remained open were now carefully closed, locked with a gentleness that felt intentional. Daniel recalled being sent to his room earlier than usual, being told to lie down even when he wasn't tired, being praised for being good when he stayed quiet. He had understood, instinctively, that obedience was expected, not because he had done something wrong, but because something fragile was being protected. At the time, he believed that fragility was him. He remembered a particular afternoon when voices rose in the kitchen, not shouting, but tense, sharp enough to cut through the air. He had paused in the hallway, unsure whether to move forward or retreat. Someone said his name, followed by a silence that stretched too long. After that, the house seemed to hold its breath. The days continued, but the rhythm was off. Meals were shorter. Laughter sounded forced. The adults moved as if navigating around something invisible, careful not to disturb it. Daniel learned to do the same. He learned when to speak and when not to, when to ask questions and when to pretend he didn't have any. And then, just as abruptly, the summer ended. Someone left. Someone else took over routines without explanation. The house settled into a new normal that pretended nothing had changed.
Schools started. Seasons shifted. Life resumed, or at least performed the motions of it. Daniel realized now that this was where his memory stopped, not because nothing followed, but because this was where remembering had become inconvenient. The summer had not faded naturally. It had been interrupted. Daniel returned to the practical task he had been avoiding. If he was going to sell the house, he needed to finish the inspection. Room by room, closet by closet, he forced himself into motion, grounding his thoughts in checklists and measurements. The routine steadied him, at least temporarily. It was in the back bedroom, used mostly for storage toward the end, that he found it. The closet smelled of cardboard and stale hair. Boxes had collapsed under their own weight, their contents long forgotten. As Daniel shifted one aside, his hand brushed against the wall behind it. The surface felt uneven. Curious despite himself, he pressed again and felt a slight give. Behind a loose panel,
Wedged carefully between the wall and the frame, was a thin notebook. It was old, its cover faded and warped at the edges. The paper inside had yellowed, but it was intact. Daniel held it as one might handle something fragile without knowing why. The object did not feel accidental. It felt placed. He sat on the floor and opened it. The first pages contained writing in an adult hand, neat, controlled. What caught his attention immediately was not what was written, but how. The entries were formatted like transcripts, short lines, marked by dashes, as if someone had been recording conversations. At first, Daniel assumed they were notes, reminders. But as he read, recognition crept in. The voices were familiar. He could hear them as he read, the cadence, the pauses, the weight of words chosen carefully. The conversations revolved around an unnamed event, referenced indirectly, always in fragments. What startled him was the perspective. The speakers talked freely, openly, without the caution they used around him. And yet, certain lines suggested something else entirely. He's asleep. He didn't hear that. We'll talk later, not now. Daniel's chest tightened. These conversations had happened in the house. He knew that now with unsettling certainty. He remembered the tones, the timing. He remembered lying still, listening to voices travel through walls and down hallways. He turned page after page, his breathing slow, deliberate. Nowhere in the notebook did anyone address him directly. He existed only as a presence to be managed, a variable to be controlled. It became clear that the notebook was not a diary. It was a record. Someone had wanted these conversations preserved, not for understanding, but for reassurance. Proof, perhaps, that things had been handled, that decisions had been made. When Daniel reached the end of the adult entries, he noticed something else. Several pages had been torn out,
and whatever followed them had been written in a different hand. Daniel closed the notebook and rested it on his knees, as if the weight of it required a pause. The room felt smaller now, its air denser, charged with something that had been dormant for years. He realized his hands were trembling, not violently, but enough to notice. When he opened the notebook again, he read more slowly. The words no longer felt distant. They pressed closer, aligning themselves with sensations rather than memories. The creak of the floorboard near the hallway, the muffled scrape of a chair being pulled back. The way voices softened after a certain hour, not out of kindness, but strategy. He remembered pretending to sleep. Not as a game, not as rebellion, but as survival. Lying still, eyes closed, breathing measured. He had learned early that stillness invited neglect, and neglect meant safety. If no one thought about him, no one would ask what he knew.
That realization unsettled him more than the notebook itself. The conversations recorded in those pages had unfolded around him, not away from him. He had been close enough to hear the hesitation before someone spoke, the way names were avoided, how responsibility shifted subtly from sentence to sentence. No one ever said, "What should we tell him?" They only asked how to keep him quiet. Daniel pressed his fingers against his temples. He had always believed that what he remembered of his childhood was incomplete because he had been too young. Now he understood that incompleteness had been learned. Remembering selectively was not an accident, it was training. The house had taught him that. He stood and walked into the hallway, notebook in hand. With every step, small details resurfaced. The exact spot where he used to sit against the wall. The door he never opened without knocking. The light switch he avoided touching at night. These were not habits of a carefree child.
They were rituals of someone paying attention. The guilt began to form. Not sharp, not immediate, but heavy. It did not accuse him of doing something wrong. It suggested something worse, that he had known more than he had ever admitted. Daniel stopped near the kitchen and leaned against the counter. He remembered standing there once, hidden just out of sight, listening to voices fracture under the strain of pretending. He remembered the moment he realized no one had noticed him listening, and how relieved he had felt. The notebook was not revealing new information. It was giving shape to something that had always been there. Daniel understood now that silence had not simply surrounded him as a child. It had been something he actively learned to inhabit. Daniel did not intend to speak to anyone at first. The house alone had already said too much. But as evening approached and the light shifted, a familiar unease settled in, one that told him he could not carry this alone,
even if he had learned to. He locked the door behind him and walked down the street. The neighborhood had changed less than he expected. Some houses were repainted, some gardens better kept, but the structure remained. It felt preserved, like a place that preferred continuity over truth. The first person he spoke to was an older woman 2 houses down. She recognized him immediately, her face tightening before relaxing into something practiced. "You look just like your mother," she said. Daniel nodded. He did not correct her. He asked carefully, circling the subject without naming it, about that summer, about the house, about whether anything unusual had happened back then. The woman hesitated, glancing toward her doorway as if someone might overhear, though no one was there. "We all did what we thought was best," she said finally. It was not an answer. It was a shield. Others responded in similar ways. An old neighbor who had once fixed broken fences avoided eye contact. A former family friend smiled too often, speaking in vague reassurances. No one denied that something had occurred. No one explained it either. What unsettled Daniel most was the consistency. "You were too young. We didn't want to confuse you. It wasn't your place to carry that." Each sentence placed him neatly outside the story, protected, distant, innocent. And yet, beneath the words, there was something else, a quiet assumption that he already knew. One man, after a long silence, said, "We thought you understood." Daniel felt something inside him shift. They spoke of the past as a collective decision, a series of compromises made in kitchens and hallways. No one took ownership. Responsibility had been diluted through time, spread thin enough to feel almost harmless. Almost. As Daniel walked back toward the house, he realized what none of them had said. No one had asked him what he remembered. No one had asked how it had felt. They had not stayed silent out of care. They had stayed silent because it was easier to let a child absorb what adults refused to face. Standing once more at the front gate, Daniel understood that the neighborhood had not merely witnessed what happened. It had participated. And in doing so, it had taught him a lesson he had followed ever since. That truth was negotiable, and silence, if shared, could pass for innocence. That night, Daniel slept in the house. The decision felt practical at first. There was no urgency to leave, and the drive back seemed unnecessary. But beneath that reasoning was something else, a quiet need to stay, as if leaving now would mean abandoning a thought that was finally beginning to take shape. Lying on a mattress he had brought with him, he allowed himself a conclusion. It came easily. An adult had made a terrible mistake. A situation had spiraled beyond control. Others had stepped in too late, choosing damage control over confrontation. And he, Daniel, had been a bystander. A child shielded from the worst of it, left with fragments, but spared the truth. It was a clean explanation, balanced, reasonable. Most importantly, it relieved him. He replayed the memories with this new frame in place, and they aligned neatly. The whispers, the closed doors, the sudden changes in routine, all of it fit. The silence had not been his responsibility. It had been imposed. In this version of the story, he had done nothing wrong. The tension in his chest loosened for the first time since his return. He told himself that the notebook had been an adult's attempt to cope, that the torn pages likely held details too painful or too private to preserve, that the missing pieces were missing for a reason, and that digging further would serve no purpose except reopening wounds that had already scarred over. Daniel slept better than he expected. In the morning, light filled the room gently, without accusation. He stood and walked through the house with a steadier pace.
Less cautious now. The walls felt less oppressive, the silence less charged. He returned to the notebook once more, flipping through the adult entries with a sense of closure. The story felt complete enough. Imperfect, yes, but sufficient. He did not need to know every detail to move on. As he closed it, something slipped free. A loose page fell from the back cover and landed at his feet. Daniel frowned. He was certain the notebook had ended earlier. Kneeling down, he picked up the page. The paper was thinner, the ink faded. The handwriting was uneven, larger,
less controlled. Childlike. He recognized it instantly, not through memory, but through instinct. The shape of certain letters, the pressure of the strokes. His throat tightened. The explanation he had built wavered, not collapsing yet, but cracking. Daniel understood then that what he had found so comforting about his conclusion was not its truth. It was its convenience.
Daniel sat on the floor with a loose page spread flat in front of him, afraid that if he held it too tightly, it might tear and take something with it. The handwriting was unmistakable. Uneven lines, letters pressed too hard into the paper, as if the writer had been afraid the words might escape. He did not remember writing it. That, more than anything else, frightened him. The sentences were short, observational, not emotional in the way adult recollections often were, but precise in a way only a child paying close attention could manage. He was angry. They didn't see me. I stayed quiet like they said. Daniel felt his chest constrict as he read. The words did not describe feelings, they documented facts. Positions in rooms, who stood where, who left first, who closed the door. The page did not speculate, it recorded. Memory returned not as images, but as sensations. The coolness of the floor beneath his legs, the smell of something burnt in the kitchen.
The way time seemed to slow when no one noticed him standing there. He had not only overheard what happened, he had seen it. The realization arrived gently, almost apologetically, but it was absolute. Daniel remembered the moment now, the exact second when he understood that speaking would change everything, that saying what he saw would fracture the fragile structure holding his world together. So he had chosen silence. Not because he was told to, not because he was threatened, but because he sensed what was at stake. Affection, stability, the illusion of normalcy that adults were desperately trying to maintain. He had believed that staying quiet was helpful. The notebook slipped from his hands and fell open to the earlier pages. For the first time, Daniel understood why those conversations had been preserved. The adults had been negotiating around the event, but the child, he, had been processing it alone. Writing had been his way of making sense of it.
And then the pages had been torn out. Not by him. Someone else had decided which parts of the truth were too dangerous to exist. Daniel pressed his palm against the floor, grounding himself as the weight of it settled in. He had spent his life believing his guilt was abstract, imagined, misplaced. It was not. It had been deferred. He understood now that while he was not responsible for what happened, he had been part of what followed. The silence that protected him had also preserved the harm, and by carrying it forward, by never questioning it, he had honored a decision made in fear. The child on that page had done what he thought was necessary. The man reading it no longer had that excuse. Daniel folded the page carefully and placed it back inside the notebook. His hands were steady now, not because the truth hurt less, but because it had finally taken shape. And for the first time since returning, he did not feel lost. He felt accountable. The days that followed passed without structure. Daniel stopped checking his phone, stopped measuring time by schedules or obligations. The house dictated the rhythm now. Morning light through dusty windows, afternoons heavy with stillness, nights that offered no real rest. He carried the notebook with him from room to room, not always reading it, sometimes just knowing it was there. Its presence was no longer accusatory. It was steady, insistent, like something that refused to be ignored again. Daniel understood, with a clarity that surprised him, that guilt was not the same as blame. He had spent years conflating the two, either absolving himself completely or condemning himself without reason. What he felt now was different. It was responsibility, quiet, unyielding. He had been a child, yes, but he had also been a witness, and witnesses, even silent ones, shaped outcomes. That realization hurt more than any imagined punishment. There was no external consequence waiting for him,
No confrontation left to face. The people involved were gone, distant, unreachable. The moment for intervention had long passed. What remained was choice. Daniel walked through the house one last time, not as an inspector, not as a seller, but as someone accounting for what had been lived here. He stood in the kitchen, where voices had once fractured under pressure. In the hallway, where he had learned to disappear without leaving. In his bedroom, where silence had first felt like safety. He saw now how that lesson had followed him into adulthood, how often he had avoided difficult conversations, how easily he had mistaken restraint for virtue. The house had not trapped him, it had trained him. Understanding this did not undo the past. It did not restore what had been lost or repair what had been damaged, but it stripped away the illusion that he was merely carrying someone else's burden. The weight he felt belonged to him. That night,
Daniel sat at the small table near the window and opened a blank notebook. His hand hovered for a moment before touching the page. Writing had once been a child's attempt to survive confusion. Now it would be an adult's refusal to maintain it. He began not with explanations or defenses, but with facts, with what he saw, with what he chose, with what silence had cost. The words came slowly, deliberately, and for the first time, they did not feel hidden. The decision not to sell the house did not come as a revelation. It settled quietly, almost unnoticed, like dust after movement stops. Daniel did not announce it to anyone, did not justify it with reason or emotion. He simply removed the listing and let the silence respond. The house did not change after that. It remained what it had always been: walls, rooms, light, shadow. What changed was the way Daniel moved within it. He no longer tiptoed. He no longer measured his presence as if it might disrupt something fragile.
the house did not demand restraint anymore. He continued to write. Some days the words were spare and factual. Other days they were hesitant, circling what still resisted being named. He wrote about the summer, about the pauses between sentences, about how silence had been offered as protection and accepted as loyalty. He did not write to accuse. He did not write to confess in the way people expected confessions to sound. He wrote to record, to refuse erasure, even when memory faltered. Daniel understood now that the house had never been holding him hostage. It had been holding the truth, waiting for someone willing to stay long enough to face it without reshaping it into something easier to live with. Keeping the house was not an act of nostalgia or penance. It was acknowledgement, a way of saying that what happened here would not be buried again under convenience or distance. On his last morning before returning to his life beyond the neighborhood,
Daniel stood in the doorway and looked back one final time. The rooms were quiet, but not expectant. They had given him what they could. He locked the door and slipped the key into his pocket, not as a burden, but as a reminder. The house had never been unsold because it lacked value. It had remained because no one, including him, had been willing to buy the truth. Until now.